The story begins on what should have been a calm, ordinary Saturday morning, the kind everyone looks forward to after a week of corporate grind. John Miller, the homeowner, sets out early with his coffee, tackle box, and fishing rod to enjoy the quiet beauty of his own property, the glassy lake behind his house reflecting the dawn sky like a mirror. This lake is not just scenery. It is his personal sanctuary, bought and paid for, yet even in this peaceful setting, his solitude is suddenly shattered by the all-too-familiar presence of Clover Blackwell, the imperious HOA president who has made it her mission to micromanage his life. She strides onto his land without hesitation, clipboard clutched like a sword and lips curved into a smug smile, and delivers what she calls a final violation notice that fines him $3,000 for the supposed crime of fishing on his own lake. Miller, stunned but controlled, reads the notice while gripping his rod until his knuckles whiten, feeling disbelief as the absurd charges pile up: $500 for unauthorized water recreation, $750 for lack of a recreational permit, and additional amounts tacked on for petty things like mailbox modifications or grass height violations. He asks in disbelief if she really thinks the HOA has jurisdiction over the backyard lake, and Clover, relishing her sense of power, assures him community bylaws grant her that authority, though a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes betrays shakiness beneath her confidence. The absurdity grows as nearby neighbors start peeking out, Mrs. Peterson overwatering her plants to eavesdrop, kids pressing faces to fence slats, all waiting to see what spectacle Clover will stage next. When Miller refuses to be intimidated, he calmly suggests that Clover pursue legal action if she really believes her claims, a remark that rattles her because most residents simply write checks to avoid trouble. Furious, she whips out her phone and calls 911. Theatrically telling dispatch there is a dangerous man refusing to comply with rules, even describing him as aggressive, though he is literally seated peacefully with a fishing rod. The scene turns into neighborhood theater as Clover paces and raises her voice for an audience. Neighbors gather with their phones recording, and children gape at the bizarre sight of someone fishing being treated like a criminal. Miller, bemused, sips his coffee as if attending a comedy show. Soon sirens are faintly heard. Clover instantly straightens up, smoothing her polo shirt and declaring with smug triumph that now Miller will understand HOA authority. When Officer Jim Thompson finally arrives in his patrol car, the contrast couldn't be sharper. Expecting danger, he sees instead one man relaxed by the water and a frantic HOA president waving binders and papers like they were court evidence. Clover, seizing the chance, rushes to him and launches into her pre-rehearsed monologue about months of violations and belligerent non-compliance, holding up her notice like it is a crown jewel of legitimacy. The officer listens with patience but cannot hide mild confusion as he eyes Miller quietly fishing. Not exactly the picture of an aggressor. He calmly asks for both sides. Miller greets him respectfully, offers identification, and clearly states his understanding. This is his property, his lake, and Clover's HOA bylaws cannot extend here without actual deed authority. Sensing the officer's thoroughness, Clover doubles down, flipping through binders and citing grass lengths, mailbox infractions, landscaping disputes, petty examples that only highlight how far she has stretched her enforcement power. The neighbors whisper, some starting to remember their own dubious citations, the collective facade of Clover's control wavering. Officer Thompson asks the crucial question: can she prove legal jurisdiction over the lake and boundaries she is enforcing? Here Clover falters. She waves laminated pages but cannot produce verified boundary maps or foundational covenants linked to the property in question. An unmistakable crack appears in her armor. Miller presses advantage, politely smiling, suggesting she show the legal framework for her assumptions, a question Clover's bluster cannot meet with substance. Then comes the defining moment. Miller strolls calmly into his house and returns with a manila folder, his trump card. From it, he produces the official county deed showing he purchased not just the lakeside plot, but the entire lake, 5 years prior to the HOA even forming. He places the deed in Officer Thompson's hands, embossed seal shining in daylight, a devastating blow that undermines years of Clover's confidence. Her face drains of color as neighbors gasp. Mrs. Peterson shrieks that they've been paying lake maintenance fees for something the HOA never owned. Murmurs spread like wildfire as neighbors realize they've been defrauded. But Miller isn't done. The survey maps show more: that the HOA office building itself sits on his land, a discovery so shocking that Clover swings between red-faced denial and pure panic. Officer Thompson, professional and calm, verifies the documents, acknowledges their legality, and informs Clover that she is effectively in violation herself, trespassing and operating commercial business activities on Miller's property without permission. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Years of intimidating fines were built on illegal ground. Clover babbles about precedent, community benefit, implied rights. But such arguments collapse against the unshakable foundation of property deeds. From there, the fallout is swift. Angry residents demand refunds, calculating thousands they've paid in fraudulent lake fees. The HOA is ordered to cease operations. Materials and offices removed from Miller's land under police supervision. Clover's iron grip, built on bluff and fear, collapses before the crowd's eyes, replaced with embarrassment, liability, and possible prosecution. The neighborhood undergoes instant change. Residents speak openly of class action lawsuits. Others cheer Miller for his patience and proof. And children watch the symbolic spectacle of authority without legitimacy crumbling before documentation. The story, which began as a man simply wishing to fish in peace on his own property, crescendos into the exposure of a fraudulent enforcement campaign and ends with the most powerful irony. Miller calmly resuming his fishing rod, enjoying the morning sun. Finally liberated from months of harassment, his lake and his rights vindicated. At the center of this suburban saga are characters who represent not just individuals, but competing forces of power, intimidation, law, and truth, each of them shaping the drama like pieces on a chessboard. The protagonist, John Miller, is portrayed as the calm but determined anchor of the story. A homeowner who simply wanted to enjoy the peaceful serenity of his lake on a Saturday morning but found himself forced into a prolonged battle with an overpowering HOA. His defining qualities are composure and foresight. While Clover pounds the ground with citations and binds herself to her clipboard theatrics, Miller remains seated with his fishing rod, coffee in hand, and a level head that proves stronger than all the HOA's noise. His role is not reactive panic but controlled resistance, strengthened by meticulous planning. Unlike other residents who fold under fines, he documents records, prepares a legal arsenal, and ultimately produces the nuclear proof, deed and survey maps that demolish Clover's entire authority. His character embodies the theme of knowledge over fear, showing that one doesn't need to scream or bully to win, only to stand rooted in truth. On the other side stands the antagonist, Clover Blackwell, the archetype of bureaucratic power gone rogue. She sees herself as the enforcer of order, striding onto private lawns in khakis and polo, armed with clipboards and binders. But her real weapon is intimidation rather than law. She thrives on scaring neighbors into submission with threats of escalating fines, citations for absurd infractions, and emergency theatrics that make ordinary situations resemble crises. Her role is fascinating because she truly believes she wields power beyond its limits, turning HOA rules into gospel and herself into a kind of suburban sheriff. Yet her armor hides cracks of ignorance since she has little knowledge of actual property law, boundaries, or jurisdiction. When pressed with specific legal questions, her face flushes, her papers flutter uselessly, and her repertoire shrinks to desperation. Her character ultimately serves as a cautionary embodiment of counterfeit authority, someone cloaked in rules but devoid of substance. Balancing these two opponents is the neutral but decisive Officer Jim Thompson, whose entry at the moment of peak drama provides the real test of authority. Where Clover expects loyalty and immediate action against Miller, she is instead met with a measured professional who prefers facts over frenzy. His role in the narrative is crucial. He becomes the objective judge, weighing the stories of both sides, questioning Clover about jurisdiction, and recognizing the clear distinction between rehearsal and reality. By calmly validating Miller's deed and survey maps, he tips the scale of legitimacy toward the truth. His character embodies authentic law and order, contrasting with Clover's theater of control, and shows how actual authority carries weight and procedure, never theatrics. Without raising his voice or puffing his chest, he dismantles Clover's bluster by simply asking for documentation she can't provide, and his presence confirms for the entire neighborhood that Miller's calm resistance had been justified all along. Standing right beside Miller is Lucy, His wife, a subtle but vital ally in this character drama. She doesn't escalate with anger or confrontation, but uses quiet confidence and legal insight to fortify Miller's stance. When she arrives with iced tea in hand, her presence looks domestic and casual, but her paralegal expertise becomes evident in how she drops legal concepts, poses sharp questions, and reminds Miller of documentation strategy. Behind every calm action Miller takes lies Lucy's preparation, encouraging him to record everything, archive notices, gather survey maps, and save the ultimate deed bombshell for when it would hit hardest. She is the strategist operating beneath the surface of the confrontation, turning a simple homeowner into a force capable of toppling years of fraudulent abuse. Her character represents the quiet but essential role of knowledge, planning, and support in standing firm against harassment. Surrounding these leads are the voices of the community, neighbors who, at first, play the role of passive audience but gradually transform into a collective force of judgment. Mrs. Peterson, pretending to water flowers while clearly spying, symbolizes the nosiness of suburbia, but later becomes a voice of outrage when she realizes she's been paying fraudulent maintenance fees. The Wilson kids initially play the role of innocent spectators, but their fascination with the drama signals how Clover's antics became public theater. Mr. Garcia, normally quiet, represents the silent majority who suddenly erupts with righteous anger when the fraud is revealed. The teenage Thompson filming from his phone becomes a symbol of modern accountability. HOA bullying now facing not just paperwork disputes, but the scrutiny of social media and cameras. Together, the neighbors form a kind of chorus, their reactions shaping public perception of Clover's fall from authority. They are first curious, then skeptical, and finally outraged, and their collective shift represents how communities awaken when intimidation is stripped away. So every character contributes to the larger drama. Miller as the patient strategist whose composure anchors the truth, Clover as the self-crowned enforcer undone by her ignorance, Thompson as the authentic arbiter of law clearing away theatrics, Lucy as the silent mastermind providing legal ammunition, and the neighbors as the collective jury turning disillusion into outrage. In the end, Clover's theatrical dominance collapses not in private but in front of that very community whose respect she sought, while Miller earns vindication not just for himself, but for all residents systematically bullied into silence. The characters together create a dramatic tableau: authority versus authenticity, theater versus truth, ignorance versus preparation. Their roles elevate what could have been a trivial HOA spat into a parable of power dynamics, showing that genuine calm fortified with knowledge defeats intimidation every single time. Viewed purely from a legal lens, the events surrounding John Miller's HOA battle reveal a textbook case of overreach, prosecutable fraud, and the triumph of property law over intimidation. It begins innocuously. A $3,000 fine issued for nothing more than fishing on his own land, but legally. Such an action by Clover Blackwell and the HOA collapses immediately when examined against jurisdictional requirements. HOA bylaws only hold validity within boundaries formally deeded or covenanted into their authority. Yet Clover assumed her power extended onto John's property and the lake behind it, without verifying deed ownership or established rights. The first major violation is one of jurisdictional overreach, where an HOA attempts to enforce rules on land beyond its legal scope. That overreach becomes compounded by fraudulent fee collection, since residents, for years, had been paying lake maintenance fees under the false premise that the HOA owned or controlled it. At its core, this is not just harassment, but financial fraud by misrepresenting ownership to extract money. Clover's next legal misstep is her call to 911 creating a false report. By claiming John was aggressive and a danger when he was calmly fishing, she engaged in false reporting to law enforcement, an offense in itself, and she put herself and the HOA at risk of investigations for wasting public resources and defamation. The officer's arrival was the key pivot when the legal lens sharpened. Officer Jim Thompson instinctively knew that any enforcement claim must be backed by proper authority. While Clover brandished her laminated binders of HOA rules, the officer requested the one thing she could not provide: recorded boundaries, legal statutes, or maps proving jurisdiction. Lacking these, Clover crossed into yet another legal void: failure of due diligence and governance. Any body claiming enforcement powers must demonstrate validity, and her empty confidence exposed negligence. This negligence, however, evolved into liability when John countered with evidence not of assumptions, but of hard property law. The deed Miller produced was the bombshell that completely altered legal perception. Dated and sealed 5 years before the HOA even formed, it demonstrated unequivocally that he owned not just his parcel, but the entire lake. From that moment, the HOA's fines were more than excessive. They were entirely illegitimate, falling under improper legal claims against private property. Even worse, the survey maps revealed their office building operated entirely on his land. Under law, this shifted the HOA from being an authority into being an entity actively trespassing and conducting unauthorized commercial use of private property, a violation with heavy civil consequences and potential criminal exposure. Here, fraud crystallized. Not only were fines being levied without authority, but organizational operations themselves were being conducted on stolen ground without lease or consent. Each HOA action issued under Clover's leadership thus became contaminated legally. Citations, fines, maintenance charges, all void by virtue of lacking jurisdiction. This massive house of cards crumbled in real time in front of Officer Thompson, whose role became less about peacekeeping and more about documentation of systemic violations. His careful notes on Clover's inability to defend jurisdiction, her admission about failing to verify boundary maps, and his recording of the formal deed transferred the entire matter from neighborhood dispute into a civil rights and property law investigation. Legally, the evidence Miller prepared could not have been more devastating. He had systematic documentation of every notice delivered, every instance of trespassing, every false claim Clover had mailed or handed over. Alongside the property deeds and survey, it built a multi-pronged case of harassment, fraudulent representation, trespass, and false emergency reporting. In legal precedent, this isn't only actionable for Miller's own protection, but opens the door to class action litigation by all neighbors who had paid money under fraudulent lake ownership claims. Even Mrs. Peterson, upon realizing she had been charged for something not HOA-owned, voiced outrage. Exactly the kind of evidence of systematic fraudulent collection that attorneys use for large civil suits. What Clover assumed was a simple scare tactic exploded into a full-scale liability campaign, likely to haunt her both personally and organizationally. The immediate outcome under law enforcement guidance was protective of Miller's rights. Officer Thompson formally ordered Clover and the HOA to cease all operations on his property and to vacate. This was essential legal relief in real time, injunctive removal from unauthorized land. Neighbors clamored for refunds and the HOA faced instant demands for restitution. With Miller's deed predating HOA formation, these demands had irrefutable foundation. Insurance carriers for the HOA would eventually step in, but the damage was done. Legally, the most powerful precedent set here was that good intentions or community benefit arguments do not supersede ownership rights. Clover's desperate attempt to invoke precedent and communal benefit failed because property law recognizes ownership as absolute. Only specific, documented easements or agreements can limit such ownership. Her failure to grasp that principle doomed her authority fully. The broader systemic consequence was reform. The exposure of Clover's fraudulent operations triggered wider inspection. County officials requiring boundary verifications for all HOAs, legal audits of past enforcement actions, and even state-level conversations about legislation for HOA transparency. From a legal angle, Miller's composure and documentation created ripple effects that protected not just himself, but established safeguards for homeowners across the community and potentially beyond. The case evolved into a template for defending against HOA overreach. Property attorneys began citing it in seminars, and neighbors became empowered to challenge citations lacking jurisdiction. Thus, the legal story arc is crystal clear. Harassment built on assumptions, false reporting elevating liability, a bombshell deed establishing ownership, systemic fraud revealed in fee collection, and ultimate legal vindication culminating in refunds, audits, and HOA collapse. It is a case study in how property law and patient documentation can transform intimidation and bullying into a decisive triumph of justice. At first glance, the story of John Miller being fined for fishing on his own land reads like nothing more than another absurd HOA dispute. But beneath the comical surface lies a rich interplay of themes that elevate the conflict into a meaningful parable about law, power, and community. The most glaring theme is authority versus authenticity, where Clover Blackwell and her HOA construct their entire edifice of authority through props, binders, and intimidation, while Miller embodies authenticity through ownership deeds, calm composure, and real legal knowledge. Clover struts across his dock wielding a clipboard like a sword, armed with laminated guidelines and petty rule citations. Yet at every crucial point, that authority melts the moment someone asks for actual jurisdictional proof or boundary maps. By contrast, Miller doesn't even need to raise his voice. His calm posture by the lake, his willingness to question her assumptions, and finally the production of his deed establish an authenticity Clover can never match. This theme resonates strongly because it reminds readers that real authority doesn't come from louder voices or scarier paperwork, but from foundations of legitimacy that withstand scrutiny. It's a clash between what looks powerful in the moment and what is powerful when tested. Running parallel to that is the theme of fear versus knowledge. Clover's weapon is fear, the threat of escalating fines, the looming specter of HOA rules, and the ultimate escalation of calling police as if Miller is a community danger. Her performance thrives on the assumption that most residents, when confronted with red ink and official-looking letters, will fold, and indeed, other neighbors had silently complied for years, paying fees for lake maintenance without ever checking who truly owned it. Miller, however, flips the narrative by choosing knowledge over panic. Instead of shouting or storming, he documents, questions, and prepares. His arsenal is not intimidation but evidence, video recordings, systematic archives of citations, survey maps, and finally the pristine deed itself. Fear is loud but fragile. Knowledge is quiet but unbreakable. The entire story demonstrates how fear as a strategy dominates until it is met with calm awareness of rights, at which point it evaporates. This theme is especially powerful because it transfers beyond HOA disputes into a universal truth. Fear governs only when people surrender their curiosity and refuse to demand proof. Another striking motif is community theater, the way Clover turns disputes into performance. Her frantic 911 call, her exaggerated cries of danger, her pacing and gesturing in front of neighbors all resemble a stage drama as much as an enforcement action. The neighbors too become actors, originally passive extras peeking from fences, watering plants that don't need water, and recording clips for potential viral social media posts. As the drama intensifies, the entire neighborhood shifts into the role of audience jury, watching as Clover's act collapses under cross-examination. This theme points to the performative nature of illegitimate power. It relies on spectacle to appear larger than it is. When the curtain is pulled back, when the deed surfaces and the truth is undeniable, the performance collapses, and the audience, once complicit, turns critical. The HOA saga becomes less about a man with a fishing rod and more about the absurd fragility of power when it is shown to rest on theatrics rather than law. The theme of justice versus intimidation also courses through every scene. For months, Clover relied on intimidation, piling on violations for grass height, mailbox changes, landscaping tweaks, then raising the stakes with the fishing fine. She escalates by involving law enforcement to amplify her authority. But when the real officer arrives, justice shifts the balance. Officer Jim Thompson exemplifies authentic justice, professional, methodical, and committed to facts rather than spectacle. His neutral investigation, asking for jurisdiction, boundaries, and statutes, contrasts starkly with Clover's frantic repetition of rules and accusations. Justice is not about drama but about careful process. When Miller provides the deed, this theme reaches its climax. Intimidation evaporates while justice asserts itself with undeniable clarity. What once appeared an uneven fight, one homeowner against an entrenched HOA, translates into a clear vindication, because the law always leans toward ownership and due process. The presence of authentic justice strips intimidation bare, reminding everyone that borrowed authority collapses when it collides with accountability. Finally, the story crescendos into the theme of reform and legacy. Miller's personal victory becomes bigger than himself. Once the deed is revealed, neighbors awaken from years of silent compliance. Suddenly, Mrs. Peterson is outraged at fraudulent lake fees. Mr. Garcia demands refunds, and others recognize they too were systematically harassed. The collapse of Clover's authority sparks a domino effect of reform. The HOA forced to vacate its office from Miller's property, refunds demanded, and potential lawsuits forming. On an even larger scale, the narrative implies systemic ripples. Officials investigating HOAs county-wide, attorneys using Miller's documentation strategy as a model, and state legislatures considering transparency laws. What began as Clover trying to scare one fisherman into paying fines ends with legal conversations that protect many residents from overreach. This legacy theme highlights the paradox that one person's persistence can create community-wide reforms. Miller's Lake becomes more than a piece of real estate. It becomes a symbol of property rights, of the idea that knowing and defending one's boundaries can stop an unchecked system and build better safeguards for the future. Taken together, these themes, authority versus authenticity, fear versus knowledge, theater versus truth, intimidation versus justice, and reform versus stagnation, weave the story into more than just suburban drama. They turn it into a lens on power itself, how it is claimed, how it is tested, and how it endures. Clover's reign shows the flimsiness of intimidation when stripped of law, while Miller shows that genuine ownership, patient strategy, and evidence can outlast all theatrics. In the end, Miller fishing peacefully again by his lake is not just about a man enjoying his Saturday. It is the physical enactment of themes resolved, freedom rooted in authenticity, knowledge outlasting fear, and justice triumphing over intimidation, leaving a legacy that reshapes not only one neighborhood, but the meaning of rights for many others. Imagine you're sitting down to watch a suburban drama on your favorite storytelling channel, and it opens with a hook so outrageous you can't look away. I got fined $3,000 for fishing on my own land. That alone is enough to grab attention, but when the camera pans wide, you see the scene. John Miller calmly holding a fishing rod at the edge of his lake, sipping coffee and soaking in the morning sunlight, when Clover Blackwell, his HOA president and self-styled enforcer, storms in with her clipboard raised like a weapon and a smirk that says she thinks she's untouchable. The opening is already charged because the absurd fine sounds like a bad joke, and her entrance makes it look like a parody of suburban power plays. Yet the situation quickly escalates into gripping conflict that feels scripted for reality TV. Clover isn't just dropping off a notice, she's shoving a final violation letter into John's face, rattling off petty citations about grass height, mailbox colors, and landscaping changes, but now escalating them into a single astronomical penalty. When John questions her supposed authority over the lake, she doesn't blink, pointing to a thick binder of bylaws as if it's scripture. Around them, the neighborhood begins to stir. Mrs. Peterson watering already drowned flowers just to eavesdrop, kids pausing on bikes to gape, and teenagers pulling out phones to record this unfolding HOA drama. The conflict crescendos when John refuses to fold, suggesting Clover take her legal action if she dares. Unused to resistance, Clover doubles down and calls 911, as if she's reporting a dangerous criminal, her voice trembling with dramatic flair as she tells dispatch that a non-compliant, aggressive man is endangering the community, even though the camera would show him calmly reeling his fishing line. The conflict becomes pure theater, neighbors pressing closer, children staring wide-eyed, and the entire setting now buzzing like a stage production of HOA versus homeowner. The climax of the episode comes as sirens wail faintly, and Clover, puffed up with premature victory, straightens her polo, smooths her hair, and confidently declares in front of the gathering crowd that, now you'll see HOA authority in action. A patrol car rolls up, door opening to reveal Officer Jim Thompson, who immediately sizes up the ridiculous mismatch, a frantic woman waving papers like she's at a courtroom trial, and a calm man sitting with a tackle box like he's hosting a weekend fishing show. Clover rushes to him like a plaintiff to a judge, spouting off 6 months of violations and spinning her binder like it's ironclad indictment evidence. The officer, unimpressed by spectacle, begins his calm questioning, inspecting not just papers but jurisdiction. Here the tension spikes because for the first time Clover is pressed beyond theatrics. "Show me the boundary authority," he says, or, "Which legal statute gives your HOA control over this lake?" Simple, factual questions she cannot answer. Clover begins flipping frantically through papers invoking community standards and precedent, but lacking property surveys or legal deeds. At that moment, John leans into the narrative script with perfect timing. He vanishes into his house and returns with a manila folder. placing in the officer's hands the pristine deed showing he owns the entire lake outright, purchased years before the HOA even existed. The crowd gasps. Mrs. Peterson shrieks about maintenance fees fraudulently collected. Neighbors suddenly realize they have been paying into a lie, and Clover's composure dissolves in real time. But then the climax twists the knife further when John's survey maps reveal more. Not only is the lake his, but the HOA's own office is built on his private land.
Meaning Clover's entire reign rests on trespassing and unauthorized occupation.
The officer verifies the documentation, and Clover's face cycles between red and pale as reality slams in like a thunderclap. The fraud is undeniable. The audience can sense the collapse. The bully is being dismantled with cold hard law. The aftermath of this climax rolls like shockwaves through the neighborhood. Neighbors who once stood silently now surge with questions, holding up their phones, demanding refunds, shouting about years of fraudulent fees. The HOA is ordered off Miller's land under police supervision, materials boxed up, cabinets of files evicted from the very space Clover once claimed to control. Officer Thompson, methodical and neutral, documents everything, scribbling notes about systemic violations and Clover's crucial admission that she never verified boundary maps. Residents begin calculating how much money they've lost. Anger simmering now no longer toward Miller, but squarely aimed at Clover and the HOA for years of intimidation and financial extraction. Social media fuel erupts as the neighborhood teenager uploads clips online of Clover pacing, while Miller serenely fishes by his dock, creating a contrast so absurd it feels scripted comedy. The HOA's false legitimacy dissolves under the bright daylight of evidence, and neighbors once cowed realize they've been scammed. The chain of events expands when county officials get involved, unleashing audits, reforms, and oversight procedures that ripple across other communities with similar HOA overreach. Suddenly, this isn't just Miller's victory, it's systemic exposure. The resolution of the story lands like the final, satisfying arc of a narrative meant to teach and inspire. Miller resumes fishing, calm and dignified, embodying patience rewarded, while Clover is left packing cardboard boxes, her once unquestioned reign stripped of power and exposed as fraudulent. The neighborhood reforms itself. Residents align on new agreements based on authentic law and mutual respect rather than intimidation. Refunds are issued, new bylaws written with transparency and boundaries, and state legislation begins forming to demand HOA accountability. The story closes not on shouting or revenge but on education and renewal, with Miller's experience becoming a model used in legal seminars, homeowner workshops, and advocacy against HOA abuse. This is the perfect ending for a story told in channel style. A hook that shocks, conflict that entertains, climax that astonishes, aftermath that broadens into systemic outrage, and resolution that inspires change. The narrative works because it satisfies both drama and justice. Clover is toppled in front of everyone, Miller is vindicated, and the community learns. Like any great tale, it reminds the audience that calm knowledge and patient preparation beat fury and fear, that rights defended with evidence outlast all bluster, and that sometimes the most powerful story you can watch unfold is one where someone simply holds their ground and proves that the law, not theatrics, has the final word.